As noble citizens, we must bypass a life of dormancy and vice to pursue the generative endeavor of a hard day's work. The benefits of these pursuits are not secured by chance or charity, but through the merit of your character and the firmness of your convictions. It is you who are planting the seeds of trees whose shade you know you shall never see.
All right, gang, we're in. Hello, welcome to the Broken Wind podcast. You keep going for a second. What were you saying there, Axiom? I'm going to introduce the show in a sec.
Oh, well, this isn't that important or relevant to the discussion at all, but it's interesting when you think about, like, data harvesting as a way of monetizing, like, internet usage. So OkCupid, which was big and popular, but only in cities and before Tinder, it was, like, the main dating app it was a website, not even an app, for a long time. And they had no ads on there because they were, the way this dating site worked was that you would have user-generated questions and you'd just answer a whole bunch of the questions, and that would give you like a percentage to see like who you want to match with or whatever and talk to. And so basically the way they monetized OkCupid was just they sold all that data and they were just collecting all that data.
Interesting. Now,
some people were sort of pissed off about that and like had privacy concerns, which I think are like fair. But, now I have, like, a steady fucking drip of advertising and propaganda just rotting my brains at all times that seems not that effective. And I am sort of like, man, was maybe the OkCupid model a little bit more of an acceptable means of monetizing free internet content? And, like, I don't know. Maybe we're coming to the Patreon future where everybody just pays for the niche micro content that, like, they like. But that also, I've been paying for the same 2 Patreons for like close to a decade now. And, I don't really see how, like, it would be exceedingly hard to get me to join a Patreon of like some new random creator if they aren't giving me a lot of stuff ostensibly for free, which means either, f***ing advertising or data collection or, maybe merch.
I needed you to fill time while I hit the vape pen, but that's a great way to start the show. Hello, welcome to the Broken Wind podcast, the next random content we're trying to get you to sub to the Patreon about. And we're doing it because we have a great podcast. Some are saying it's the best podcast out there. And I am your host, Butler. I'm here with my super producer and friend, Vane.
What's up?
On the ones and twos. Ready to deploy some tactical clips that we have curated for you today. And we also have my friend,
too many clips,
Axiom here, giving us a brief history on OkCupid. And I brought him in as a specialist and a sort of warrior because we're back in the Thunderdome. Get ready. We're returning. We had some debate on about whether this really was actually a sequel. It's more of a spiritual sequel to the liberal Thunderdome, but there had been some stuff. It's not quite a forbidden course because we're talking more contemporary stuff, but there had been some stuff happening in the news that I really, really, really needed to talk about and dissect sort of as a subject. And what I'm talking around here is basically the idea of ethno-nationalism, the idea that like a nation has a sort of racial character and those who don't fit within that racial character need to be purged. And what a disgusting, vile, and historically failed idea this is, just for like from absolute like a preponderance of evidence. There's no question, and anyone who believes otherwise is a f***ing dullard and should be written off entirely. So that's what we're here to talk about.
I'd like to add
this is also
I'd love to add that this is an ongoing discussion that evolved from our last discussion in the forbidden courses on
the Thunderdome.
Yeah, we were talking about liberalism, and we noted toward the end of that episode that it's kind of impossible to get really deep into the discussion of liberalism without also crossing into the overlap of nationalism. And that in itself is just as broad and contradicted as a subject as liberalism.
Well, and there's also, this is also a spiritual successor to the anthropology episode too, which is a great one. If you've never taken that forbidden course, I highly recommend. But that is...
There will be an exam.
Yeah, there will be a test. But we mentioned scientific racism and eugenics a lot in that episode because it's what, whenever we get into the same to the W's and L's of liberalism, we did a similar thing with anthropology, and those subjects are, I think, important to understand just because they're bullshit. And you should know when you want to be informed about the bullshit so that when people start bullshitting, you can hear them and be like, this person is just full of shit. They're full of bullshit. And people who really invest any significant amount of importance into racial identity outside of just a sort of ooh, that's interesting. Wow, your family came from there sort of thing. It's small talk is all. At the end of the day, it is nothing really meaningful or important about what kind of person you are. It has no determinative quality, and culture certainly does.
Historical materialism
doesn't exist, right? This is not to say that race does not exist. We would never be so reductive to say that, but it is to say that people who assign overimportance on these things are the worst kind of dullards and are dangerous historically. There's a preponderance of evidence for that too. So we got a lot of points we're going to cover here. I have shock collars on both of my co-hosts to keep them in line in case either of them starts getting too worked up, because there's going to be a lot to talk about here, and I wanted to have sort of a 30 minutes of hate thing because I hate these bastards. I'm so tired of these pigs wallowing in this shit being the representatives of the country that I'm from and I grew up in. And it's not I want to be nationalistic in any sense, but I do feel great shame.
Well, you don't like to talk about the Western ideas, the greatness.
That's why you can be such a classicist, my friend, and that's one of the things I got tired, because it's not that I think that those ideas are worth getting rid of, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but it is the worst people in the world, including a lot of the people we're going to talk about here now, are also classicists. You know?
I put myself right in the middle of them, unfortunately, whenever I decide to analyze the Republic or things like that. You know what?
You love Plato more than the average person, and it's one of your charms. But
yeah. So, I want to... one thing I want to point out when we're, getting into this entire topic. I do want to kind of challenge, the idea that all people who endorse any idea of a race are necessarily horrible or whatever. Just given that I think I live in East Oakland and lots of people
the states
lots of people also openly celebrate being a part of Black culture specifically. But I also want to talk about it's weird that we're even using this term ethno-nationalism, because that implies ethnicity versus what we're talking about here, which is race,
Right.
And so I think historically it's important to keep a few things in mind, especially because there has been such a whitewashing of, this concept over people who it wouldn't have applied to literally at all. First off, I just want to point out that the concept of race is only a couple hundred years old, and it is constantly changing. I've read tracts where Benjamin Franklin argues that the only white people are English people, and that the Irish and the French
Germans. It's very funny.
Yeah, well, and the Irish and the French. See, I would be considered by him swarthy. You see,
yes.
Although, which is also interesting considering he came to France and had sex with a whole bunch of French women. So I think it's important first off to recognize that for most of human history it wouldn't be what race are you, because European people wouldn't think that they had anything in common with other European people in terms of some sort of heritage or whatever. And that's the construction of the idea of whiteness has in a certain sense I think it's kind of true when people say that white people have no culture, because we gave up our cultures to be white people, to be the
I agree.
To be the non-race or the neutral race or the dominating race.
Yeah.
We kind of gave up being fucking Irish or French or Italian or whatever the hell we were,
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
Now, I
For
also
the sake
want to
of
point
building
out,
the secular state, I think is what we'll argue.
Yeah.
Right.
So I also want to point out that, like, you know, as much as a concept of race didn't exist, I think it's probably true that back in the day, a lot of people hated foreigners way more than, you know, we necessarily do today, to the extent that I think it was just in a lot of places, particularly ancient Greece, you know, foreigners were subhumans, and that was just the way it worked. And I think it's also that's also a hilarious fact that I like to bring up a lot, because, like, here's the last thing I want to say before we can kind of move on with, you know, all of Abe's important historical caveats. And, you know, Stavros Halkias actually touched on this in his Netflix special, that there was definitely some resume building when it came to ancient Greeks being appropriated into white culture. Geographically, linguistically, down to the fact that all of those marble white painting, or those marble white, not paintings, sculptures, used to be painted. And they were painted the different colors that people were in ancient Greece. They had curly hair, they had olive skin, like, you know, and I point this out not to be like, we should take whiteness away for Greeks, or American Greeks aren't white people or whatever. But I bring that up to just point out that, like, you know, because there's a deep and very influential ancient Greek culture that also, you know, because of things like climate and written language and the use of stone, we also have access to a lot of archaeology for that time. So that's a big part of why we think it's so important. But, like, there's definitely some resume building going on. And then finally, like, it's also just a pet peeve of me. I think I brought this up in our Plato episodes, that there's always this tendency to try and write off classic Greek philosophers as dead white men, given that this is literally thousands of years before anybody considered, like, f***ing Greek people and Scandinavians and French people and f***ing Italians one thing, where historically most of them probably thought that all of these other people were complete subhumans and wouldn't think that, you know, an Ethiopian person was any more of a subhuman to a Greek person,
or a Somali,
like, or a Persian or whatever, you know, like any of the other people they interacted with, you know. So, like, ethno-nationalism in a certain sense is very new and very modern, because in the grand scheme of things, race is very new and very modern. But it's also kind of, you know, the policy of, or the thesis, the ideology of, where I'm from is the best place, and you if you aren't from here, is probably one of the oldest ones in the world, you know? So and not to say everybody did.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that through line.
But also there's the expansionist layer to it. I want to stop for a second too to address what you were saying about ethno-nationalism up top. Because the specific reason I chose that term is because I don't want to get sidetracked by talking about Israel, but I also want to say that, like, almost pretty much everything we're going to talk about here today in terms of, like, this ideological drive applies to Zionism and, like, the Zionist project, the, like, ethno-nationalism of that. And it's like the same. The reason, like, even though Nick Fuentes and his ilk are ostensibly anti-Zionist, I still don't see any daylight between the ideology they believe in, because it's about Christian white people, or the ideology of, like, some of your worst Zionists because it's about Jewish white people in the Middle East. Essentially, I see them as wanting to accomplish the same sort of project, and even if there's a schism now, it is something that's mostly out of political convenience, and part of why I find a person like Nick Fuentes so repellent is just that, like, these people all have the same goals, which are, like, racial domination, essentially, is what they want. And I find it disgusting, essentially. It's just how I feel.
Could I
I wanted to get on the mic and talk about that with y'all.
I think one of the things that you're talking about, how there's a similarity between more ancient states, I guess, for lack of a better term, ancient states and modern ethno-nationalist states, as we're going to talk about. And as we talked about really in our Florida series, if you want to hear really the story of the building of this specific flavor of racist ethno-nationalist state, you can look almost nowhere better than the history of Florida, and that is a promo for our Florida series. But also, there is, I think, a through line that runs from ancient civilizations like ancient Athens and ancient Rome that connects the idea of quote unquote Western civilization up to the modern ethno-nationalist state. And I think that through line is the conception of civilization and all of the baggage that ultimately comes with that term.
Well, and I want to make sure to mention the ethno-nationalists that we're kind of talking around here, which are the Nazis. You know them, you hate them. They were really bad people, and they did really, really terrible shit. And I don't mind being unambiguous about that. And we're increasingly living in a world where I think it's important to be, and as publicly as you can possibly be, and as angrily as you can possibly be. And I wanted to make sure to sort of give a brief outline here while we're still early in the show about the post-World War II global order and how like race and ethnicity fit into the world that was constructed then, because I think it's important to sort of start there as a part of this discussion, sort of where we left off in the liberalism episode 2 in some ways. But we're not going to get too detailed here, but the main reason I wanted to bring this up is to just show that, like, even though the Nazis were beaten and they were a very pernicious and evil nationalist, ethnically centered project, and there's a lot of like neuroses in there too that we can talk about, and the differences between them and different other fascists. But the more important thing is that America, in its role in beating the Nazis, was really it's like the Soviets really worked really hard to open the pickle jar, and then we came in and popped it at the last minute. Like we played an important role, there's no question, especially in, you know, like just by putting our political might behind it on like from a diplomatic perspective. But the less than 1 million people in America dying in World War II compared to the 20 plus million that the Soviet Union lost is part of why
10 million in China
and some other leftists get prickly about the Soviets, even if they're not around. Like, they're not around anymore. It's not something I ever want to fight about, and we're certainly not going to get into too much in this episode. But before we got on, we were talking about how the identity of being the country that beat the Nazis, even though we really didn't do shit to beat the Nazis, and in fact were part of the inspiration for old Hitler, is something that has really just created this funhouse mirror effect in this country that we're living in now. And I want to give the mic to you, Axiom, to see what you might have to say about like the post-World War II global order, and like how race and nationalism sort of fit into that, and how, like, especially the Anglosphere, like that's something I wanted to sort of talk about here too, because I think that there is a racism to the Anglosphere, but it's very sort of like different and pernicious in a subtle way. I don't know.
Yeah, I think even in the Anglosphere, I think thinking of like Hollywood as a lens and portraying scary German or Russian people as the bad guys is an important element to realize when in the way we tell our stories about ourselves.
Right. Or black people too. I mean, God, like, there's so many horrible depictions of that. So like,
it's so clear that the Nazis are the existential bad guy in our own story of ourselves and the stories we created and told and spread around the world. And I think that's really important, as you're saying, for building the post-World War II empire, the idea that you are allowed to police the world. You really need to create a very compelling story that you triumphed over the most evil concept ever.
I guess in simple terms, I'm going to ask, was the New Deal racist? We're finally going to solve that problem, right?
I mean, first of all, the New Deal was before World War II. I think that's the first thing if we're talking about why we shouldn't necessarily go down that road. But, so... I mean, basically, like, you know, I don't think we can necessarily talk about, like, you know, the idea of, like, nationalism post-World War II without talking about, you know, the three countries that decided we were going to be superpowers after that, namely the United States, China, and the USSR, which are all intensely nationalist countries with, you know, different, like, stated political ideologies. You know, we've all kind of ended up, like, vaguely neoliberal, but like saying that we're not, sort of an imperialist neoliberal countries. But at least, immediately following this, you have most European countries, which became very cosmopolitan after World War II.
Yeah.
The part of the rejection for countries like France and England was definitely still holding on to a lot of its like colonial powers, and France still has
it's
colonies
prestige.
and stuff.
Right.
They continued to hold on to Vietnam and shit like that. But there was the construction of the UN after World War II is a big moment for cosmopolitanism and people being like, and so I want to, I always got to bring up my boy Kant a little bit. He's a very important figure in Western philosophy and the growth of European cosmopolitanism, which is more or less the thesis of like, it's good for different countries to exist and do life and politics differently, and having like a diversity of nations is a good thing, and everyone in every different nation is just as morally important. Like, American lives are no more or less important than, Chinese lives would be like the cosmopolitan position.
Right.
But, it's more or less like the countries that took on cosmopolitanism didn't become like the most rich, powerful countries in the world. What they became are countries like Europe, where it's like, welcome to Berlin, we have the best clubs, we still have problems, especially with Islamophobia, but, like, people have healthcare here and stuff like that. They became like, sort of outside of
Marshall Plan.
And don't get me wrong, there's still countries with a lot of power that are doing a lot of evil things, but then you have like, it's kind of hard to think about them in the same category of post World War II countries as the United States, Russia, and China. All of which, like, to this day, if you go to, like, other countries in the world, like, the United States is sort of thought of like Russia or China, where to most other people, like, it's less about, like, the ideology or whatever, or the specific histories, and it's about, like, that is a big, scary country that does some evil shit and has a lot of money and a lot of people. And also, like, there's a lot of cool culture stuff there because they're the big boys.
Yeah, like regardless of how the ideology of Russia has evolved, it's still a big, scary country in the mind of the American.
They're very powerful,
and
there's no
they're
question.
powerful, and China too, whether we don't necessarily pay to the intricacies or the evolutions of Chinese communist thought, but today we're going to, and I'm really glad that you brought up the U.S., Russia, and China 1, 2, 3 like that, because I think one of the major things we want to talk about is the first world, second world, and third world nationalism, and they literally go in that order. So I don't know if you were doing that on purpose or not, but great job.
But great podcasting, yes. The first, second, and third
let's
world
continue
are
down that road.
Yeah.
Do you guys have other stuff to say about, I was just making the point that those three countries are the three superpowers, and they're the ones that we're like, nah, f*** your cosmopolitanism.
Well, I do want to say about Russia's relation to Europe and whiteness that I think it's actually very sort of like interesting and sort of fraught.
Very fraught, yeah.
I think that Russia is... in a lot of parts of Russia, they consider themselves part of Europe, and I think that like some Europeans would consider Russia a part of Europe too. I think most Europeans would.
They're quite literally caught between two worlds, the first and the third world.
It's culturally so different and so much larger and such just a whole different sort of thing than than little old England, even at its like colonial peak. So,
and I think another point
that's different. What were you gonna say?
Another point that Axe brought up that I'm excited to talk about, that I'm glad he brought up, was how Kant pointed out essentially this philosophy that diversity will be our strength, that becomes the emerging concept of a global internationalism, as you said. Whereas I think the idea of what we used to consider existentially evil, the Nazis in this society, is quite literally the argument that diversity is our greatest weakness, and that if we are too diverse, our civilization will crumble. And we're going to talk a lot about these arguments that they're going to bring up.
Stupid and detestable and dangerous that it is. That's really like the central thing I want to talk about.
That's the dichotomy right there.
First, second and third world here, and I think the first world is like doesn't really have to be too rigorously defined, because guess what, if you're listening to a podcast, you're probably in the first world. I'm going to be honest with you, especially if you're speaking the English language. Also, an extremely good chance you're in the first world.
Guess what, second world doesn't exist, so we also know that you're not in that.
Well, you mentioned, I think that it's interesting to mention it in the trio of the US, USSR, and China, because I don't know if you'd situate the USSR in the second world, but countries that were on the border of aligning themselves between the US or the USSR were the second world. That's what that ostensibly was, and he's right. It doesn't exist anymore. Italy is is the example I was going to use of a country that was considered the second world. It was like the Marshall Plan was the offer from the
the Soviet Union, and a second
the
pole.
Soviets would have something, right? Like that, there was a second trade pole.
Yeah, rather than living in a unipolar world after the Cold War, when all the remaining socialist states collapsed and the only alternative to capitalism ended,
right.
You actually had pockets that you could consider the second world that were not quite like the third world and were not quite like the first world. They were fast emerging.
But the key difference, too, is that they were not colonized. That is the important detail we need to make sure to understand, is that European monarchical colonial projects are what essentially define the third world. If you were colonized by some European asshole, if you're in the Congo, if you're in Vietnam, if you're in China, if you're in I don't know, the countries south of us that are being bombed and attacked now, are getting ready to be, like, you're in the third world. And that is what the third world means, always has meant, and we're going to get into the ideas of third world nationalism as defined in China, but I want to hear from my friend Axe here. What were you going to say about these definitions?
So I might be wrong about this. I'm looking it up. I think the way that it was... Yeah, no, dude, that's not the way it's always been used. The way first, second, and third world was already used was first world was capitalist countries. Yeah, so, okay. The second world was the USSR.
Yep, exactly.
I wasn't sure if it was within that.
And the third world was countries that were neither.
Yeah, it was the USSR was the next biggest holdout to the U.S. colonial empire. So it was the second world that it was sovereign. Like you said, it could do whatever it wanted within its own domain.
Well, so, like... but also it's not just the USSR, it's also independent countries like Korea.
And that's where Italy can be bordering that. If they can form a relationship with the USSR.
No, the second world was the USSR, and, like, it was just any, originally this is how it was used. It's used differently today, obviously. But it wasn't necessarily allied with. They could be, like, in conflict with each other.
Absolutely. Yugoslavia was an example that was possibly in conflict at times with the USSR, but would be considered second world at the time, I believe.
Yeah, like at the end of World War II, these countries had the choice of going the communist. That's kind of how I understood it and understand it still. And that sounds like kind of what you're describing, is that not every country in the second world would obviously go on to have a good relationship with the USSR. Most of them would have very bad ones, for being honest, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think having this discussion about the first, second, and third world, my favorite book I've ever read that's discussed that was The Jakarta Method by Vincent Bevins.
Would highly recommend that.
And definitely got to recommend that one, because that was where I first learned about the original use of the second world and the third world, and that the third world had not originated as a term of a negative term. It was actually
derogatory term.
It was not a derogatory term. It was actually a term of self-actualization.
Yes, it was aspirational. And I want to just stop for a second with all my hosts to just think about how awful that is, to think that, like, I've been using that even in my own life as a young, uninformed person to say, it's like a third world country. I'm sure I've said that at some point in the past, before I knew any better. And it's obviously being used by the most powerful people on Earth right at this moment, which is why I've brought this quorum together to get pissed off together in the Thunderdome. So, I mean, that's where I'm at with how that, like, term, how I understand that term. I don't know. Do you have anything else you want to say on the subject, actually?
Yeah, can I suggest that we actually, like, can we maybe punch in what I'm about to say to, like, the beginning of this whole discussion? Because we never actually got out what the original definitions were or how they're used today.
Yeah, absolutely. We can.
Okay.
I don't know if
So
we'll
I
be
think we
able
should
to
just have,
do
like,
that,
a
or we
punch
can
in.
just make sure we define them here. I'm not sure.
Yeah, sure.
I'll see if I can
I mean,
add them in at the beginning if there's continuity. We'll see.
Yeah, because just like we tried to say it a bunch of times and we kept interrupting each other. So I think we should just have it for like the audience to be able to hear. Like,
Yeah, definitely.
this is what we think each thing is. Okay, so I'll just read off, or like, so we have it, I guess. Originally, these terms were meant to communicate that the first world was a capitalist country, the second world was a communist country, and the third world was neither capitalist or communist. So I think you were saying a couple times in this discussion that you thought that the second world was between the USSR and the United States.
Right.
Which I don't think it was. I think that was what the third world was meant to mean.
Yeah, you're right. I might be wrong on
Yeah,
that. So,
there's
I bring
some
up Italy as
borderline
that
issues,
example.
like countries that weren't exactly comfortable in the second world. China's even an example as it's emerging. Where do you draw the line? And I would argue even now that as the rest of the world is recognizing it's no longer a unipolar world, that does mean that there's an emerging second world. And who would that be? That seems like it's China that's building their new carve out outside of capitalism, that they're able to have their own system, a new iron curtain.
Before we get sidetracked on anything else, too, thank you for reading those definitions. I want to talk about, just to say that, like, the reason I brought up Italy as definition for the second world, too, it may not be technically correct, but I brought it up because Italy's communist resistance to fascism internally is vastly like misunderstood, I think, within the Anglosphere specifically. And this is the Anglosphere is something like I want to make sure this like part of this discussion too is there's so much we don't get. There's so many like important layers to these historical eras that we miss out on because we get told these stories through a language that's mainly spoken by people who are like trying to tell this story a very specific way. So trying to like hear and understand those things. I've been very lucky to like learn more about Italian leftism and its specific history, and like the in general, like they were some like very nasty things that happened afterwards, and a lot of it has it's a very complicated history we're not going to get into fully, but like they had the strongest like democratic mandate they would ever have after World War II. And it seemed not like out of the realm of possibility that the Italians would, via democratic means, essentially move closer to the Soviet Union than to the United States.
Yeah, they were recognizing the largest communist party in the quote-unquote Western world, which I think is where I was understanding what you were saying by putting Italy in the second world, that I also consider it
might not
the clearest
correct,
one. I agree with what Axe said, that the definite clearest one is the Soviet Union, but then there are other sort of borderline cases that aren't so clearly within the Iron Curtain, but have been able to build some amount of autonomy, or that become kind of situationally, I would say, like kind of sort of borderline in the second world. And then by the end of the Cold War, it's clear that there is no alternative. You have to be either a first world or a third world country, which I think starts to move on to why we reinforce it in these negative terms of then saying, again, well, that's like a third world country. And it's, we see that with the shithole countries comment that Trump said in the past. And that's unfortunately a common attitude that many people have developed in the post-Cold War world, I think.
The Cold War. The Cold War.
There are two options. You either live in one of the good countries or the quote-unquote shithole ones. So it becomes very easy to think in those reductive terms, I think.
Yeah, and I brought this quorum together because our shithead ass president has been spouting off about Somali people in Minnesota. And as different people from different parts of the country who live in, I'm sure, communities that are very diverse in different ways, I think any like honest red-blooded American who I can see eye to eye with, if they don't fucking feel like the best part of this country is the fact that there's any type of person here at any time, and that's part of what can make it so interesting and exciting and different. Like, that's one of the things of the many like shitty and unforgivable things about American history. The fact that a more pluralistic and like multicultural society that's probably ever been exists in this place. That's cool, and I get so fucking disgusted again. But and maybe that's not true either. There probably are different examples, but it's a very diverse place, and that's one of the best parts about it. And I think all of my co-hosts would agree with me on that. And I have a few clips prepared here, or my producer does, of what the president said specifically about Somalians in Minnesota. So
you want to hear that?
You would roll that.
Yeah, you want to roll the Somalia racism clip?
Yeah.
That's what I called it.
Did you want to say something, Axe, or are you just adjusting yourself? See, that's American excellence.
Sorry, I'm not. I didn't take the iPad with me.
You're good. You're good. Yeah. Play the.
All right, here we go.
Sorry, my bad.
No. That's exactly. Okay. All right, start it.
Somalians ripped off that state for billions of dollars. Billions. Every year. Billions of dollars. And they contribute nothing. The welfare is like 88%. They contribute nothing. I don't want them in our country, I'll be honest with you, okay? Somebody would say, oh, that's not politically correct. I don't care. I don't want them in our country. Their country's no good for a reason. Their country stinks, and we don't want them in our country. I could say that about other countries, too. We don't want them the hell. We have to rebuild our country. You know, our country's at a tipping point. We could go bad. We're at a tipping point. I don't know if people mind.
This is really ironic here, the tipping point.
We could go one way or the other, and we're going to go the wrong way if we keep taking garbage into our country. Ilhan Omar is garbage. She's garbage. Her friends are garbage. These aren't people that work. These aren't people that say, let's go, come on, let's make this place great. These are people that do nothing but complain. They complain. And from where they came from, they got nothing. You know, they came from paradise, and they said, this isn't paradise. But when they come from hell, and they complain, and do nothing but bitch.
It's not coming through very well for either of us here, but it's still, I think that...
Yeah, this racist diatribe that he went on that was definitely the clearest of the racist diatribes, because I actually looked for the clip of the shithole countries one, too. Right. And I don't know if I got, like, Mandela effect, but I could not find, actually, an example of it. And I think that all of it was actually reporting of the situation, and I'm not sure that there was never a recording of that incident, although everybody believed at the time that there was no doubt that he would say such a thing. But I think this is probably the most clear racist diatribe that he's been on. He's really losing grip on some part of his brain.
I mean, it's just fucking sickening. And
it is sickening.
I'm just going to look up his comment for myself here so I can maybe read it, because we couldn't hear it.
I mean, he basically said, we don't want them in this country. He said that they're garbage people and they're not productive and all they do is complain, and they come from a shittier country than this one, so they have no right to complain, essentially, even though he complains that we need to make America great again because America sucks, doesn't it, Don?
I mean, it just... apparently J.D. Vance banged the table in agreement, too, during this disgusting diatribe also, so I don't know. Had you heard it before at all, Axe?
Yeah, a little bit. I don't know. Orange Man bad.
I mean,
there's hardly anything to say about it. It's just one of the most reductive, clear examples of modern racism. I mean, what we're talking about here, the core of ethno-nationalist belief, and saying that we don't believe that diversity is a strength. We believe it's our greatest weakness.
Yeah, and incidentally, Somalia, one of the countries that was f***ed up by Italian colonialism, but you know, Americans afterward and others too. It's like the behavior of contributing with our state power to the disarray in a country, and then treating these people who flee from that country to the place where the wealth of the country that they're from is being sucked to, and where ostensibly they're allowed to assimilate by a legal process, and then being told that, like, oh, actually, we think you're garbage. It's disgusting. And the turnabout from the Somalians of Minnesota has been hilarious for anyone watching that too, of like aping the style of meme of the Israelis by basically just like completely fabricating their own indigeneity by manipulating architecture, like by manipulating just like narratives into like a similar style that are hilarious, but it's making people furious. And it's just, I wanted to talk about all of this because I feel like ethno-nationalism is something that is quite deep-seated in American culture, and something that I don't know if people are always as aware of as they should be, how deep strain it is through America. So we have, like, there's a clip that we have of Asmongold saying some similar garbage about Ilhan Omar. I don't even think I can, bring myself to try and listen to it. It might not even get through.
Ilhan obviously responded to that. She went on, now it's called MS Now, and several other stations, and she responded to Trump as she should, responding to those horrible whatever was said about her. And so she rightfully called him a pedo, said that he's trying to distract from the public's questioning of the Epstein files, trying to distract from the war crime hearings that are happening now over the random killing of civilians in the Caribbean. And that in itself, I think, relates a lot to what we're talking about.
For sure.
With the idea of a civilization, quote unquote. And there's these competing visions of civilizations ultimately at play here, that some people believe the definition of being a civilization means you don't have to act civilized and you can act in the most barbaric possible way, including dropping nuclear bombs on civilians. And that you have the right to act that way as an exception to the laws of civility. And then there are other people, like the strain of thought that started probably with Kant, as Axe said, or I'm sure it began even before the idea of a more global, inclusive, diverse world. But those are the two competing ideas of civilization, essentially. One which says that civilization is when powerful people get to do whatever they want and they get their way, and that basically civilization means power through sheer dominance of force, or civilization means abiding by some sort of laws that everybody else in the world also adheres to and acting as an example. And I think that's something we even discussed in the conversation about Plato's Republic, that when you have a word like civilization, it kind of implies that you're supposed to act with civility.
Right.
And it's sort of hard to, I find it hard to conceive of another form of civilization.
Yeah. Well, and I want to ask my friend Axiom a question to help me sort of draw the thread between the Nazis, the US of A, and the British. And specifically because I don't know if people understand or are aware that, like, the Nazis had this funny way of being like, we're sorry, we have to bomb you, Britain. They're like, but we're brothers, really. Like there was like this sort of like, and it's quite well documented that Hitler saw Lebensraum, the urge that like was like, oh, we have to claim our Volk in Poland and all these other parts of the country. That was aped around the idea of manifest destiny. Like Hitler wrote that, like, those ideas were inspired by one another.
Just as we're talking about in our Florida series, and the things that guys like Jackson go on to do, or even before them, Madison and Monroe, trying to inspire these quote unquote patriots to do what we now understand as illegal settlements in regions.
Right. So I want my friend Axiom to sort of like give me his opinion on like the connection between the British, the Americans, and the Nazis, and like where that sense of nationalism sort of has a common thread.
I mean, so on the one hand, there's the original idea of manifest destiny, which is like a quasi-religious belief on the part of people colonizing the United States and continually expanding westward.
Can I get a free real estate?
That there is a God-given f***ing mandate that Americans should eventually take over the entire country. I mean, even referring to ourselves as Americans, given that that's two f***ing continents, is already part of that ideology. And the cost of that was a literally immense genocide that, in terms of numbers, completely outmatches the Holocaust.
For certain.
And the Holocaust also, if you read Mein Kampf, was literally part of what inspired Adolf Hitler.
Absolutely.
Now, I know it's always kind of sketchy when a white guy has read Mein Kampf or whatever, but I've read a lot of stuff, guys.
You mean like the president?
I've read a lot of stuff. Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know, though. I also, if you talk to a leftist historian of World War II, they're going to have read Mein Kampf, So.
Yeah, I'm not in that club yet, but...
I'm not defending sus people who've read Mein Kampf, but, it's definitely a red flag. But also, it is if you want to understand, how to fight Nazis, I do think it's important to understand what they actually thought they were doing, rather than
absolutely,
merely taking your analysis from secondary sources that are biased against them. And one ought to be biased against the Nazis for sure.
I completely agree.
Just because you should have a bias doesn't mean that it's going to get you closer to the truth of a matter.
Exactly, man. That's why I wanted to have you guys on.
And so, I have also, I will admit, as a white man, I have read quotes of Adolf Hitler. I did not read them because of solidarity. I read them to recognize my enemy. And so
I think be sneaky. It's annoying.
Yeah, I think it's important to know some quotes from Hitler, and I think there's one that I can think of that specifically relates to this, where he's writing specifically in opposition to Marx's concept of international socialism. And he said, "We might have called ourselves the Liberal Party. We chose to call ourselves National Socialists. We are not internationalists. Our socialism is national. We demand the fulfillment of the just demands of the productive classes by the state on the basis of race solidarity. To us, race and state are one."
Yeah.
And that is a clear and decisive. He is literally saying, I am the antithesis to Marxist thought. Here I stand. And I think that's very clear for whenever one of these assholes say, oh, the Nazis were actually the socialists. Make it very clear that you actually have read enough Hitler to know that that's complete bullshit.
Yeah, and I think that's a great quote to bring in, because it's now we're dancing with very dangerous stuff, and there's no question about it. This is very, very contentious subject matter, the idea of what should the nature of the nation be. But I think what my producer just read there is absolutely the antithesis of what any of us believe on this show. And then more importantly, the idea of socialism within a singular nation is what would later drive a subject that we're going to only try and touch on, but the Sino-Soviet split and the different conceptions of socialism, and where a nation like China might still have its challenges that I personally feel chauvinistic, even really digging into the details of, but I don't disbelieve would exist, that Han ethno-nationalism might create layers of oppression in China that I certainly wouldn't want to live within. So that, without getting too much further there, I want to just tie the knot off on the British, and to say that I think that the Nazis didn't really lose, and I don't think that's they lost, but the ideology that drove them ended up being on the winning side via the British and the Americans. And I mean, Churchill's Bengali famine should, at most, I feel like it should be pretty well known, but it's he put up some numbers in terms of genociding people or attempting to. And then America First, it's so on the nose. That's what pisses me off off so much about these people. The original America First movement was a movement that was so openly sympathetic to Nazism that these people had to scrub it off of their resume afterwards when it became gauche to be in favor of Nazism. And that includes people like Gerald Ford and Richard Bissell of the future OSS. It's insane, like how on the nose this stuff is. Not to be, I need to stop using that word for stuff like this, but it makes it's not good for your mental health. I feel like I think to face this stuff. But I think also talking about the concept of internationalism, it's important to recognize that neither side is mutually exclusive to the idea of international. Both of them are working internationally, even though Hitler is accusing these mysterious global forces. He actually works hand in hand with other foreign governments that are sympathetic to him and is building his own international order all around the world. And so you have basically the flow from one to another is not so clean. And as you said, it's not so clear to say that the Nazis were easily defeated because we had two parallel streams throughout the World War II period that I would call the brain drain and the rat line. And both of those are basically working in opposite directions. Yeah. Actually, no, they're both working in the same direction, but for different reasons, I suppose. That you have many people like Einstein and internationalist thinking Jewish people, for example, are minorities, that basically when they compare the alternatives of these two competing civilizations, they have a pretty clear and easy choice. And so you have the concept of brain drain, where many Jewish people decided to leave Germany because it was pretty obvious where you'd want to go at that time. And then you have elites escaping, as you alluded to earlier, that it wasn't such a clear defeat of the through the Catholic Church. The reason we call them Swiss bank accounts, shady places where money gets stashed from, is because basically the Nazi gold was swindled through Switzerland into the Vatican, and we all know that, and it led to a pipeline to Argentina. Before we go too deep, I want my friend Axiom to hold space for him to tell us why he thinks the Nazis didn't lose.
I mean, I think the Nazis pretty clearly did lose, honestly.
They did lose. They did. You're right. The Nazis did lose in a major way.
Here's a tendency that I'm going to criticize you for a little bit, to paint any sort of racist authoritarians as Nazis, when, like, the Nazis were specific racist authoritarians. Now, it's fun to insult people, and it's fun to call people imply that people are kind of un-American.
And that's what I'm here to do. I'll be honest. But
here's the thing,
what I'm here to do.
I think there's nothing, this is the problem, is that there's nothing more American than doing all the things that most leftists are pissed off at Nazis about. Which also weren't the reasons. Yeah. Now, it's also really interesting. So, like, you can call Americans Nazis, but really it's more like you should call Nazis Americans.
Amen.
I think that's another part.
If you believe diversity is our weakness, then that's kind of Nazi-like. And some would say that's un-American-like, but it's sort of the original when we were doing the Manifest Destiny stuff.
I mean, this is a country that, is built by diversity, but it's against the will of the people who make up that diversity. You know, like, they didn't want to be here when they were building this country, So, like, I think that, this is part of why, I caution people about using, Nazi authoritarianism as, like, the sole example, because the thing about the Nazis is that they turned their back on every single ally they ever had, and they never developed something akin to soft power internationally, which has become, like, the way that, not just power is extended via capital throughout the world in terms of business, but it's also, like, the way that the Cold War was fought, in a series of, like, proxy wars that wasn't really between, like, Nazis and Americans, So I think, like, focusing in on...
I know what you're saying.
Add to that?
Agree.
But
I'd love to just say,
between the USSR and the United States, But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the Nazis people often say that the Nazis were a very aesthetic regime. And I think that that's true. They focused a lot on the optics, but they were the wrong optics, ultimately, is what the whole world saw that. And ultimately, it became, like we said earlier, kind of the subject of movies and became like ridiculed by the quote unquote Western world after that. Like a concept taken that far is obviously vile and evil and disgusting and can be basically the existential bad guy of all movies that came after that for the sake.
Well,
so
all right, and
I want to pose a
Nazis
hypothetical.
I'll say it.
I also want to pose a hypothetical.
They lost culturally that we made them the bad guys in the movies, but also subtly they infiltrated our culture at the same time. And so it wasn't a decisive defeat.
No, but here's the thing is we killed them with guns. That's a fucking decisive defeat. Like, you know, I understand this feeling of like
not enough.
There's still an ideology that like has maybe sort of spread, especially like in an aesthetic dimension, but like anyways, I'd like to pose this hypothetical. I'd like to pose a historical
and FDR that it was like FDR and Stalin thought they should kill the entire Nazi high command, and Churchill lost his whole hat about that because he thought that was way too much.
What I'm saying, I guess, is like they say what decisively won the Civil War was who decided to back which side, and it's like ultimately slavery, chattel slavery in the South just looked grotesque, and enough people didn't want to back that in terms of international wealth. And I think that while the Nazis were highly aesthetic, it was the wrong aesthetics, and the whole rest of the world went on to agree, like, yeah, it still was disgusting.
But here's the thing. So I want to pose a hypothetical for you guys, right? And if you could please let me like get to the end of this before we jump in, that'd be great.
Sorry.
So we have it on the table, right? That the Nazis like weren't. Yes, they did a horrible genocide, but you know the United States, in terms of like numbers, did 20 of those, and were in some ways like more successful. And yeah, they had an authoritarian form of government that was very evil, and they also like embraced things like street fighting and just like raw state violence as their policy. But what camps. I wonder, okay, so we found out all of this shit and we used it as a historical justification after the fact for why the US was the good guys or the Russians were the good guys. And like I think that morally, in retrospect, hindsight being 2020, that's kind of a fair position to take. But here's what I want to ask. Let's say that Nazi Germany didn't expand its borders beyond Germany. Now, I know it's not the same country, it's not the same ideology if we're imagining this, but let's just imagine that they had themselves an SS and they had themselves a Holocaust, but it was only within Germany.
Right.
Can we honestly say that anyone would have ever stopped them?
No, absolutely not. And I agree. Like, that's the difference between Portugal's dictator Salazar and Spain's dictator, what's his name? Franco. That ultimately Salazar went on for decades and decades longer for, I think, that exact reason. Even though they were highly similar, ultimately Salazar did a better job of integrating himself into the global economy. And Franco ended up looking much more clearly on the lines of fascism.
Well, and I, sorry to cut you off, but my thing is that the Nazis lost definitively because a whole lot of USSR soldiers went down in that fight too, amongst other things. And that's one of the reasons why I find Slavic neo-Nazism so perplexing, even though I've like heard explanations of it that make sense, but it's still like they didn't think you guys were human either. Like you guys weren't part of Europe to them. Like that, you were not. So like I don't know. So we're getting way out there, but what were you going to say?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that emerging. I always love to talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union, as you know, and I'll try to keep it short. But I think, though, as we talked about the Second World, this has to do with part of the collapse of the Second World. And I think, as you kind of touched on that, this concept of Russian nationalism or even Russian whiteness at times that ultimately played into, I believe, the collapse because they started to want to compete with the Western world in terms of being able to put their feet up and have kind of an underclass. And that also became tied up in their sense of nationality, is if we don't have people doing our own bidding for us and we don't have our own colonized people to work for us, can we really even call ourselves a global competitive empire, the likes of the United States? So they had to embrace more and more Western exploitative things that ultimately brought their economy down, aka liberalism.
It's interesting too, given that like you look at the literal borders of Russia, and there is a large population who live in that landmass that don't think of themselves as Russian and still think of themselves as colonized by Russians. But yeah, you know, I think like it's also important to recognize that Russia as a country, both before and after the USSR, this is important for thinking about the invasion of Ukraine today, is a country where there's a strong part of the political identity of its ruling class, from czarists through communists through fucking, you know, Putin, basically have all taken it to be like kind of their duty to always expand Russia's borders, which is like more Nazi-esque in a certain sense too, and that's also part of why at first they were friends, you know. But then also, like, that's the interesting thing too. We can always ask the hypothetical of like, you know, the USSR and Nazi Germany had a peace treaty and were kind of allies for a while, and then Hitler was like, nah dude, we need that land. And you can also kind of ask, like, fuck, man, like, what would have happened if, like, Hitler had never betrayed Stalin? Notably, Stalin probably would have been
talking
like, this fucking fascist is...
Well, yeah, and before we go into too many hypotheticals, too, but I thank you for bringing it up, because it's a great segue back to the third world, which is where I want to bring the discussion now as to sort of, like, now that we've sort of really gone down the whole of, like, what is the like, European, like, ethno-nationalist conception that... have played itself out throughout the course of World War II and had like various different sort of nationalist conceptions coming at each other. Like, this is all where I see this stuff sort of following from the liberalism episode, and maybe you could disagree, but it brings itself to China and the Chinese. And one thing I want to make sure to say, and I want to thank my co-host Axiom for bringing the hint of religion into this whole discussion, because it's incredible we've even gotten this far without talking more about religion, and I think it's like such a critical part of European nationalism, in particularly like the historical processes by which that was formed. And I know that my friend Axiom is a fan of Eastern religions as myself, as I am too. So it's like something about the religious. Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're both Taoists.
This is a Buddhist/Taoist podcast, actually. Yeah, in case you weren't aware, the dialectic.
Yeah, and overall, like something about, there's all sorts of, you know, fraught historical conditions I don't know about as a non-Chinese person, but I know that in general, the idea of monotheism and the like myriad wars and conflicts that have been fought throughout the U.S. I mean, there's the Boxer Rebellion, right? Like they've been there. It's not like they're non-existent, but they are not hegemonic in the way that they are in Europe. And some would say that sort of leaves them outside of the shadow of Rome, right? Not because I know one of my friends here loves to talk about Rome, but like it creates a very different political condition, and I would argue a more secular one in some ways, which is something when it comes to governments I tend to be a fan of as a liberal. So
perhaps it's because China's not using Rome as the model to build off of. They consider the definition of civilization.
I want to say I don't think that this is like I think the Uyghur Muslims would be a little bit disappointed in this line of thinking, as well as the Muslim minority in Myanmar. But yeah, I just want to, even speaking as a Buddhist, I do want to shout out to the Muslim minority in Myanmar who are potentially facing genocide at the hands of Buddhists. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's
so
all
like I don't know. I think there are links to be made between specific religions, but
I would never go so far as to say like that totally doesn't exist and is not happening. It's just I feel like weird as a Western person even commenting on it and believing my own media about Muslim lives when like they don't give a shit about them when it's not convenient. So it's like it puts me in this like awful bind that I don't know what I can do or say, and it's like it's not even worth bringing up a lot of the times. But I mention it because I wanted to sort of lay out a definition of third world nationalism as I understand it, as outlined by Mao, and I may be incorrect, but I want to sort of hash it out with my friends here because I think they've both had some exposure to the idea, so I want to hear their thoughts. And my understanding is basically that third world nationalism, Maoist third world nationalism specifically, is a anti-colonial movement specifically. The idea is that it is meant to be a revolutionary resistance to the colonial forces that have defined China up to that point. And that is like what makes it kind of different from the nationalism of Europe, and what I find kind of fascinating and want to learn more about it that I don't know. So I know there's other characteristics to it, obviously. I mean, communism with characteristics, people would say they're just doing capitalism, but I also believe that personally, as a communist, I don't think we can, shy away from understanding and participating in the world of business to the extent that we're need to survive in a world where, for the most part, these ideas have lost. They have not been successful. They have only barely just started to make some sort of headway in, building something that is different than the fraught and religiously racist and insane and deranged stuff that we're living through now. So that's kind of where it's I just hope that something more rational can come from that, and I don't believe that it's free from contradictions, but that's where my understanding of third world nationalism is. So I want to hear my co-host's thoughts on that.
I think too with that there's also, with third world nationalism emerging, there's a fear, I think, in the first world of the influence of the third world. And that's been the case for a very long time, like the Red Scare in the US, the idea that, there are credible fears of the idea of, say, the Soviet Union in the 1950s
Absolutely.
Spying on Americans. There's a reason to find credible fear in that. But then there's paranoia, like what ends up happening with the Rosenbergs.
Yeah.
And you can't deny even the fact that these people being Jewish and the level of outrage that happened and the connections between Jewish people and Eastern European people, that there was a lot of deep-seated fear and anti-Semitism based in that. And while some of that is valid, there's also, I think, reason to believe, if you believe in the cause of internationalism, there is also reason to work within your own empire and to try to build a collaborative world. And I think that that's one of the key parts about third world internationalism, like you said with Mao, that's a key part of the philosophy, essentially, that if there is this influence, and there is always internationalism, as I said, you'll still have Hitler still working behind the scenes to make connections with international people, even if he's accusing his enemies through projection of globalism. But it's like everybody is trying to explore the whole world, find all their possible options within the entire world, and to build a network around the whole world.
Well, the Chinese have definitely people would definitely have valid criticisms of the internationalism of the Chinese too, but I want to hear my friend Axiom's thoughts on the definition I've sort of laid out there of third world nationalism and what their understanding of it is.
So what's the definition of third world nationalism?
So my understanding of it is a concept that is basically in opposition. It's a reactionary concept in some ways because it's in opposition to being colonized, and it is an establishment of the national sovereignty of, a previously colonized place. And that comes with all of the baggage of that place. And that's where you get these eruptions of violence like the Cultural Revolution or Tiananmen Square. One of my favorite fun facts about Tiananmen Square is that part of what got Tiananmen Square rolling was that Chinese students were mad that there were African students who were in their universities getting their like resources and not speaking the same language as them. And it's like, like, I think that,
and it's because a country that provides free education,
and a country that also has like isolated itself, like, and has like, you know, the same baggage of like cultural affinity. Like, that was something I wanted to bring up in this discussion too, that like, I don't think it's unnatural for people to feel like, well, no, I want to hear what your thoughts are first on third world nationalism before I talk about that. But like, that's what do you think?
I mean, so it's hard to dive into, you know, Maoism without, you know, diving into, I think, what a lot of the least valuable parts of Marxism kind of were. But in a nut, you know, the way I position myself is that, you know, I broadly agree with Marx's critique of capital. However, Marx's inversion of the Hegelian dialectic, the idea that he's not looking backwards the way Hegel was, but that he was looking forwards. Now, some people think Marx didn't exactly actually believe that he could tell the future, but a lot of like Marxists do. And so I think broadly,
you caught me.
the way, yeah, okay, we can tell the future and we're Marxists. Like, capitalism is going to inevitably fall by the year 1900. Like, dude.
Yeah.
Like,
no, it's not really like that. I'm just
I understand him as an evolving person.
Mao is, when Mao inherits this like inversion of the Hegelian dialectic, because really I think Hegel is the one who up things in the first place in his reading of Kant. But anyways, I'm not going to get into that. But he's saying, okay, and he's taking this perspective, which I think is actually like a perspective that a lot of American leftists have, and I think it ends up being a lot of the time, especially to actually like working class people, is this idea of, hey, I can, broadly speaking, understand economic relations to such an extent that I can not only, like, explain in retrospect, as Hegel would say he could, and a lot of people would disagree with that, but I can say in the future the sorts of things that you're going to do and give you the economic justification for them. Personally, I think that's terribly entitled, and I think it's really condescending to working class people. And, you know, there's this sticker that leftists like to put on their bikes that say, you're not a capitalist, you're a communist with Stockholm syndrome. And I think that's kind of the attitude that Mao was taking there towards people in third world countries. Because I don't think it's actually true that if you talk to people living in these countries and living in these colonized places, that they're going to conceive of it in Marxist terms or talk about it that way.
Yeah, right.
Certainly when I've talked to indigenous people, they aren't by and large like, well, the material relations of my colonizers and me are such that communist revolution is the only avenue available to me. You know, they normally explain things in terms of their own cultural conceptions, which are different and, I mean, also unique to individuals, you know?
Right.
So that's my 2 pennies. I don't think Marxists can read the future, and so I don't think Mao's idea of, you know, I think there's different types of nationalism, you know? I think that, like, dude, if you go to different countries, they're going to oftentimes describe the reason that they think that they're the best country in entirely different terms, because a lot of the time it has to do with a historical mythos or, like, you know, what, like, they'll tell you like a story of how the country came to be, and that's why it's an important one. And then you go to another place and they're like, I don't care about some bird and some f***ing like snake. What the hell are you talking about? You know? So yeah, exactly. Like, you know, so I do think Mao was kind of projecting there, and I think that historically it actually, those projections, those speaking for other people, results in colonialism all the time of like, oh, hey, we need to like go to South America and genocide you guys so that you can find Christ, you know?
Right.
But yeah. That's why we should all watch Aguirre. But yeah, that's my 2 pennies.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think ultimately, it's hard to always say that you're reading Marxism the proper way. But I think that would lead to the idea of like a no true Scotsman, essentially. But my understanding of Marxism is that it ought to be an evolving ideology and that we don't make a doctrine out of Marx. And so the things that Marxists today believe are not what Marx originally believed. And that's okay, because if you think about the process of a revolutionary ideology being passed down from on high, from, as I always like to go back to, from the idea of philosopher kings and an aristocracy down to a real working class ideology, it should take several generations in order for this ideology to proof itself out and to go from really what is a high liberal ideology in Marxism and the idea of scientific socialism to a more working class ideology that I think you start to see coming about first in Lenin and then in Mao. And that's why these people have been embraced, for the most part, as part of the doctrine of Marxism, if you can say that it has a doctrine.
I don't want to get too in the weeds on the disagreements between the different factions of Marxism-Leninism, but I do want to say, and I think we can agree on this, that whatever disagreements we might have with Mao, he has been influential. He has been influential even outside of China.
Without question.
And
to Marxist thought.
Yeah, and even like, I don't know to the extent that like even the Vietnamese had some influence from Mao, but I do know that like the Chinese and the Vietnamese are at odds all the time. And like that came up in Cambodia, certainly. But my favorite quote from Marx that I think oftentimes I come to when like thinking about stuff like this, that's one of the best quotes of all time. And I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on it, Axiom, is that people make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. So what are your thoughts on that one? Because I want to tell you what I'm thinking about that, and we'll bring it back to nationalism and ethno-nationalism.
I mean, I think it's sort of like, you know how I feel about that quote? I feel the same way that I feel when people who believe in a lot of conspiracy theories are like, don't you believe that the government's doing a whole bunch of things like that are secret and stuff? And I'm like, yeah, I believe that that's happening. Like, I agree with that thesis. But I'm skeptical of people who say that they know exactly what it is.
Yeah. Oh, you know the
so like,
sure.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you know, I think that's true, you know, but like if you think you can tell me what exactly the fucking like causal chain is, I'm kind of like, no, you can't.
All right, pal. Yeah, that's funny. I like that. Yeah.
I do think the idea that you can't make history in a complete vacuum, you couldn't summon the power. Perhaps in America, that people will say, you know, a socialist will never be president in America, and you have to accept certain realities at the time that are within the realm of possibility and others that aren't. And I think that is clear that that's true. You can't just make history in a vacuum, but I do think that in the post-World War, to tie it back to the discussion of nationalism, in the post-World War revolutionary world, I think it's important to start to recognize why the conditions of this new third world internationalism started to emerge with its own clear ideology. And I think part of it's because you have some of the most massive world-spanning quote-unquote nations being formed in the wake of the world wars at this time, such as Russia and China, two of the most diverse regions in the world. And they have to figure out a way to make such a diverse group of people be able to play together. And even though they speak many different languages, just like all empires do, to try to impose one common language on them and one common ideology.
Well, and I think
that that's the post-World War situation.
Thank you for bringing that up, because what I wanted to say is that like I see exactly what you're saying, and like that contradiction within a given polity, however the border is defined between people. I mean, we don't have time to get into the story of Indonesia, but it's extremely germane to what I'm about to say.
Yeah,
which
great
is
example.
That, like the tension between different populations that live shoulder to shoulder but don't speak the same language, it is this it doesn't matter what other circumstances are going on. Like, if you have two different kinds of people who live shoulder to shoulder and they don't speak the same language, there's going to be this like awful suspicion that develops, and I don't like it, but I think that like it's something you have to root out proactively. You have to teach people like, no, even if you don't know, like, it's not something to be afraid of. Like, you can't like you can't turn these people into like a boogeyman, and it's like it's not something that can be passive at all. It starts with, you know, learning about each other, learning each other's languages. Those are really important steps, but we also have to like be very vocally opposed to people like Nick Fuentes and the president and Asmongold and shit like that, who want us to act as if our ethnicity and linguistic combo that we just happen to get by the genetic lottery are special by some means. And I'm saying, no, it's disgusting.
Right.
I hate these people.
And it's just interesting, I think, that ultimately these nations that are late to the game, so to speak, have managed to put together a recipe that suddenly allows them to emerge and grow at a much, much faster rate. And I think that you should take a look at that, essentially, when you start to see that situation coming, that it looks like an emerging empire is growing faster than you. Maybe take a look at the recipe that they're putting together and the conditions which force them to put that recipe together in the first place.
Well, Axiom, I want to ask you, too, like, what do you think are the inherent challenges of a multicultural, multilingual, multi-ethnic society, and why those challenges are worth overcoming? Because I believe with deep conviction that I will never, ever, ever want to live in a overly homogenous society of any kind. And I never have, and the closest I've ever been, I didn't enjoy it. So what are your thoughts?
Dude, honestly, I don't think it's as scary as everybody makes it out to be.
Yeah.
You know, I live in a neighborhood where I have a bunch of full-service sex workers outside. Across the street, there's a bunch of Chinese businesses, including a place where I want to shoot pool, but I'm not really sure. I hear them doing karaoke in Chinese.
You can bet on anything.
And then across the other way, there's a liquor store that's owned by a Muslim family, and I saw like 14-year-old Muslim kid with a giant pit bull run somebody off the block the other day. And it's kind of rad. I don't know. It's a little noisy, but like. That's the thing, dude. Like, I don't know. Like, what the fuck? Like, it's just mind your own goddamn business, dude. Like, that's it. Just, like, be nice to your neighbors and, like, fucking, like, keep your head down and, like, eat at the most delicious restaurants you've ever been to.
God,
and,
enjoy
like,
some different
like,
food.
It's not, like, I don't know, dude. Like, I don't think it's, like, that hard. Just like live next to people, and like, I mean, dude, I don't think any of the people who own the liquor store across the street where I'm gonna get some Henny to put in my eggnog tonight, I don't think any of them drink. Like,
probably not.
Dude, you can fucking like just tolerate your neighbors and do whatever the hell you want, and like if you just mind your own business and don't with other people, I think it'll be fine. You know, and like I think, you know, I'm not an anarchist the way many people.
But how could we give everybody health care in this society with so much diversity?
It's because we have to get rid of all the Mexicans and all the people who don't speak white English. Yeah, like that's why I wanted to have that sort of question posed to you, even if it is silly, obviously, to someone like yourself, because it's a silly thing for people to struggle with, and yet we have people in this goddamn country who feel like this diversity is the weakness. This diversity of belief and nationality and ethnicity and race is what makes us, is what's the problem here. And they're the worst ass on earth. And there's charlatans and bamboozlers, and I just hate them, and I hate the ones the president. I just want to have a little struggle sesh with you guys. So that's what this is.
Yeah, well, no, I'm with you. Here's the thing, too. I think that there is a certain type of person where they might become a hypocrite in every conceivable way. They might fucking fail in their faith. They might cheat on their wife. They might hit their kids. They might eventually have to, you know, accept SNAP or EBT. But the one thing that's never going to happen is they're never going to wake up tomorrow and be black or be gay or be trans or be a woman or whatever. So that's the thing that they latch on to judge, because every other thing that they could judge morally, like, they might end up doing, you know? And I think, like, being a good person is accepting, like, yeah, I'm gonna f*** up and be a bad person sometimes, and that's gonna be rough, and I'm gonna have to come to terms with that and do my best to prevent those times from happening.
Yeah.
But I think if you make the story that it's like, oh, this thing that could never happen to me, even though, like, who knows, there's probably a way that you're not thinking of that could, especially, like, with becoming a disabled person. Most people become disabled eventually.
Yeah, exactly.
So you really shouldn't say the R word, because
you live
it
long
will
enough.
probably apply to you if you live long enough. Yeah.
I don't know what I said.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like, I mean, you know, most ways of dying even include at least a few minutes of it.
Right.
But anyways, you know, I think that on a personal level, I think that's what people are latching on to. And
that's a great point.
I think it's easier when people are segregated, you know?
Yeah.
I don't want to say that there aren't, like, shitty f***ing oppressive people in Oakland. There obviously are. But, like, I do think there's something to be said for, like, yeah, dude, if you live in a purely white area, it costs you nothing to be racist as fuck. You know, and it costs other people a whole lot, but that's the thing. You might cheat on your wife, so, you know, are you going to judge adulterers? You know you're not going to be gay tomorrow, so you're going to judge gay people. And I think it's similar with ethno-nationalism. I think people go crazy with it. But I think especially, like, I think this is very true for men in this country. There's a lot of guys who developed nothing else except for being a white guy.
Yeah.
And movies and television and culture told them that they were going to get a hot wife.
Yeah, good
and
job.
all they had to do was be a white guy with a job. And I think they've also lost their shit when they have nothing to offer anyone.
Because there's not
and
anything
so
for
they
anyone
want
in
to
this
blame
fucking
other
country.
people.
Yeah, I mean,
there
like,
are no jobs.
It's like, yeah, dude, very well said. Especially what you said about how it's like this immutable thing that people, like, all these other humiliations they might still be forced to deal with, but they know they won't have to deal with that one, so then they can look down on that person. What is it that's quote that's like, when education fails, the only aspiration of the educated is to become their oppressors. Who is that?
Oh, somebody smart. I've definitely heard that one before.
I don't know that one, but I was thinking of the LBJ one that we've used before, like about finding a white man you can pick the pocket of a guy who looks down on another person.
I think we can close this one out. I don't know if you fellas have any closing thoughts.
I guess my closing thought is listen to the song Little A, Big A by Crass. You can be a lifestyle anarchist.
Yeah.
Like, you don't have to wait for the revolution to start being cool to your neighbors. You know, that's what I'm going to shout out.
Yes, I agree. I think knowing your neighbors and being, like, friendly in an interpersonal way is a revolutionary thing that you can do every single day and should. Like, you should know your neighbors' names. It will change the way you go about your life, and it's worth doing. It's a small thing, but
one might call it a social revolution.
Just a little thing makes a big difference. I don't know. That's the way I completely agree. So I want to say, President, Asmund Gold, Nick Fuentes, Destiny. You guys, who else should we take shots at while we're here? I want to take a lot of shots. You guys are gonna get any? Who are your guys? Who are your guys? Who do you hate?
Ethno-nationalism as an ideology.
Yeah.
You, Mr. Kent, you threw me in juvie. You bastard.
Yeah.
Mr. Kent.
Yeah.
And Mrs. Davis.
Yeah. Also, the person who cut me off this morning. You.
You know who you are.
Yeah. All right. Oh, and the people.
They might have just been in a rush to
being
work.
mean to us on Hexbear too, and also if you're listening from Hexbear, thank you for listening. But if you were being unkind, how dare you? We're just doing our best here. So I just need to get my friends together to get pissed for a minute with me about how fucking annoying these people are, and sort of talk about, like, where these ideas come from. And I think I feel pretty good about what we got here. You guys got anything else you want to make sure to insert here? You want to plug anything before we close the show out?
Oh, Three-Eyed Moose
Awesome.
Hash
All right.
Company.
Well, hey, thank you for listening.
I think the Minnesota Somalians are welcome.
Yes, Somalians welcome on this podcast. If you're Somalian, shouts out.
Your memes rule.
Your meme game is so powerful right now, guys. We see you. We love it. Keep it up.
Oh, dude.
So, all right.
Amazing Somali American memes right now. Yeah, so good.
So, all right.
Yeah.
this has been the Broken Wind Podcast, the forbidden courses, but also about the news. I don't know. I needed to get the gang together for this one, and I appreciate you guys so much. Thank you so much for listening. If you've listened this far, please consider subscribing to the Patreon and follow me at Butler's Ghost, where I post my stupidest thoughts. I was trying to think of a good post today about a guy who's never knew you had to take the underwear off. He just kept putting new underwear on. But I couldn't think of a way to make that make sense.
Dude, taking your own panties off is
Like, you change the underwear? No, I'm fucking put the new ones on over it.
Hey, dude, like, what's next? Wiping an ass? Like, fucking...
What, do you fucking wipe, too? Yeah, you touch your own butthole? Yeah. Maybe this does have legs. I was caught up on how big and sticky his ass would be. That was the part that I was thinking about. Like, you were just at the biggest. Whatever. All right.
Dude, did you see on Blue Sky when they f***ed up the algo for a bit? So everyone's Discover page was just like lots of ADLP, adult baby diaper lovers, like f***ing shit.
No, but bring that back.
Shouts out my ADLP people. Like, I'm not into it, but I'm glad that you guys seem like you're having fun.
Yeah.
I see you at Folsom sometimes.
Yeah.
Didn't see as many this year.
Oh, you're talking about adult baby diaper lovers.
Yeah, the Blue Sky.
You're adjacent to the community.
Well, I mean, I'm just an open-minded guy, you know.
That's awesome, dude. I mean, I've never seen an adult baby diaper lover in person that I'm aware of, so that's pretty cool. And respect.
You got to go to Folsom. You'll see lots of things that like you've never seen in person.
I know, dude. Maybe someday I'll.
I might be doing them.
I might take my first whippet with you, pal. We'll talk about that another time.
Never done a whippet? That's crazy.
We gotta end the show. We're getting horned up. You're both getting shock collared right now. And
you gotta come to my wedding. I'll definitely give you a whippet.
Thanks, buddy. Thank you. But thank you for listening again. If you've come this far. And we'll be back soon to, get worked up about this or that thing and, do our best to have some fun with each other. I'm not doing a good close here. I'm just going to end it. I'll talk to you later, everybody. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
We don't highlight the means, so we settle for them greens. Yeah, I'm high like the trees. When I send it to my knees, I don't sway with the breeze. They can't send me to my knees, yeah.